Hello, everyone. It's Miss Clonico, and we are here to talk about topic 7.3, which is all about the measures of development. And remember that development is really focused on the different ways in which we understand both the economic and the social side of things when it comes to how a country kind of compares to other countries, if that makes sense. And we're going to start with SPS 7C1, which is really focusing on the different ways that we measure social and economic development. So we're going to start by talking about social development and the ways that we measure that level or that aspect in countries. So when we're talking about social development, it's more focused on the quality of life and the levels of equity that people experience within a society. And equity has to do with how equal people are treated and whether or not there is what's called parity between different groups of people. As opposed to inequality. This can include looking at things like income distribution, which also ties to economic development, birth and death rates, fertility rates, infant mortality rates, childhood mortality rates, access to healthcare, caloric intake, gender inequality, voting rights, life expectancy, and literacy rates. So there's a lot of different things that go into understanding whether or not an area is considered to be socially developed. And social development and other kinds of development can be examined at different scales of analysis. And that can include global rates, regional, national, and subnational. And it can be really, really, really illuminating to compare national data to subnational, since it can reveal inequalities within a country that are hidden by the overall national numbers. And it's really important to pay attention to the scale of analysis when it comes to things like development, because it can be very misleading since most of the time the data is presented at a national or regional level, and you lose the variability within those larger kind of cohorts of groups of countries, and it really doesn't give you a total picture. So it is really important to look at the data at a subnational level as well as at those higher levels. Now, low life expectancy, which can also be influenced by child and infant mortality rates, can suggest that people don't have access to adequate nutrition and healthcare or live in unsafe conditions. And so that can indicate that they are not very socially developed. Access to education in particular is another way to measure development, including literacy rates and literacy rates across gender. Increased access to education also tends to relate to improved economic development in a country. Now, the economic development measures that we tend to look at are sort of focused on these bigger picture ideas of what's called GDP, GNP, and GNI. And when we're looking at those bigger picture things, gross domestic product is what stands for, or that's what GDP stands for. GNP is gross national product, and GNI is gross national income, and it's looked at from a per capita level, meaning by population. And we also looked at things like the sectoral structure of the economy, income distribution again, and then the use of fossil fuels and renewable energy. So starting with GDP is the value of all goods and services that's produced in a country over a specific period, regardless of the producer's nationality. It tends to be a better indicator of the country's economic health than GNP, which measures the total value of all the goods and services made by a country's residents and businesses in a specific time period. In this case, it doesn't matter what location you're in as far as the product, meaning that if you're an American citizen with a business in another country, the value of what you produced in that country counts towards the United States GDP or GNP, not the other country. It doesn't count the value of things that are produced in the country by foreign residents and businesses, though. So that's one of the reasons why GDP tends to be a more favored form of measurement. GNI, or gross national income, is looking at the total income of a country's residents and businesses, including investment income, regardless of where it was earned, and money received from abroad, which would be remittances, as well as direct foreign investment and development aid. And it's usually given in per capita numbers, meaning it takes the total and divides it by the number of people in a country. And you can see that here with the GNI, that it's looking at what's going on in those areas. And then we'll talk about PPP in a minute too. And it tends to be more an accurate measure for countries that receive foreign aid and investment. So it gives a better total picture of what's going on. In general, looking at GDP, GNP, and GNI per capita is a more accurate measure of wealth and economic development than looking at the overall numbers for a country. And it allows for easier comparisons, But it can also be difficult to make comparisons across countries because of the differences in the value of their currencies. And so that's where like PPP comes in, because that's called purchasing power parity. And it basically is looking at the differences in what things cost in a country and kind of comparing that across countries. So like, for example, let's say that you and someone in another country both make $50,000 a year, but in that country, it's more expensive to buy, or it costs more to buy a pair of sneakers than it does here in the United States. And so that would mean that you have greater purchasing power parity than the other person because your money goes further. It is really important, however, to make sure you guys know what goes into each of these measurements and what a high or low score indicates. It's not enough to just be like, GDP means this. Make sure you know what goes into it, okay, and what it's looking at. Now, the other thing, there's other measurements of economic development, including the sectoral structure of an economy, which can suggest levels of development. Economies that are mostly made up of primary and secondary sectors are considered to be less developed than those with tertiary, quaternary, and quinary sectors. And it's also important to know the difference between the formal and the informal sectors of the economy. The formal sector is the part of the economy that is officially recorded with the government, monitored, and taxed. In developed countries, this tends to be the largest segment of the economy and what most people work within. The informal economy is the part of any economy that is not officially recorded, monitored, or taxed by the government. And it can include things like under-the-table payments that are not taxed, like babysitting money that's paid in cash, black market buying and selling, small-scale industry that isn't formalized or in a traditional setting, roadside stands, things like that. Generally, this includes people with little to no formal education or training and is often made up of women. In many places, it's much harder for women to get jobs or an education, and therefore it's harder for them to be in the formal economy. So you see more women in the informal economy. And the informal economy is more common in developing countries, where it ends up being a bigger segment of the economy than the formal sector. However, the money produced within this sector is not counted in the measures we addressed above, which means that they don't represent the actual economic condition of a country, and the income itself is not taxed, which results in less government revenue. Another thing that we look at is income distribution, which also gives a look at the economic health and development of a country and the levels of equity that are present. This shows how a country's GDP is distributed among the population, in the sense that, are we looking at even distribution, uneven, highly distorted, relatively equal? And that tells us a lot about what's going on in a country if the income distribution is really skewed or really even. Another thing that we look at is energy consumption and where energy comes from. And this also helps us understand a little bit more about economic development, because it looks at the rate of energy consumption and whether or not it's from fossil fuels or renewable sources, and whether or not the source of the energy is domestic, meaning within the country, imported from other countries, or reliant on foreign companies to extract and refine the sources, especially if it's fossil fuels. And that would be like if you live in a country where you have a lot of oil reserves, but the companies who are pumping the oil and refining the oil are from another country. Renewable energy sources are being looked at as a potential growth area for developing countries in particular, and a way for them to get away from economic dependence on other places, as well as energy dependence. All right, that's going to take us to the end of this EK. So I will be back shortly to pick up on our second one for topic 7.3.